Before the shaping of mountains and the laying down of rivers, before the first stars kindled in the vast emptiness, there were only the echoes of the music, the vast chorus sung at the beginning. From that harmony were born the Valar and the Maiar, spirits of differing strength and stature, each a fragment of the great design, each a note lingering in the vast and still unfinished song. Among them were those kindled with the essence of flame, beings radiant and swift, carrying in themselves both the warmth of life and the danger of consuming fire. They were not yet corrupted, not yet named Balrogs, but spirits of light and ardor, companions to the great smith Aller and the radiant Vardar, lending brilliance to the newborn firmament. They moved like sparks across the void, and in their fire was the promise of both creation and destruction. In the quiet, when the discord of Melkor began to stain the harmony, some of these fiery spirits found themselves drawn to him. He spoke to them not as a master demanding service, but as a voice promising boundless freedom, power unshackled by the limits of the music. He whispered that flame was not merely to warm or to illuminate, but to consume, to dominate, to reign, and in their pride, or perhaps in their restless longing, some turned. Their fire, once golden and bright, became darkened with shadow, their brilliance cloaked, their heat sharpened into a scourge. Thus were sown the seeds of the Balrogs, though the name was not yet spoken. What once had been spirits of joyous flame now walked cloaked in terror, and yet, even in those early ages, the ruin they would bring was not fully known. For in the great wars of the First Age, they served as lieutenants of Melkor, towering beings of shadow and fire, scourges against the hosts of the Valar and the Eldar. Their whips of flame and their towering dread scattered armies and silenced courage. Yet the memory of their high origin never wholly departed. To look upon them was to sense both terror and sorrow, for these were not born demons, but beings who had chosen a path that led them away from the light. Still, there was no inevitability in their fall. In every age, the choice of allegiance, the yielding to pride, was the hinge upon which their fate turned. The world itself bore witness that great power, when corrupted, becomes its own chain. The burn for mastery is to be mastered by the fire within. The Balrogs, in following Melkor, did not ascend but diminished. They exchanged the freedom of flame for the bondage of shadow, and though they strode mightily in battle, they walked always in the echo of loss. Their very presence testified to a paradox that the mightiest of spirits, once turned, can become prisoners of their own ruin. The ages passed, and battles raged across the vast lands of Beleriand. The Balrogs led hosts of darkness, striking terror into the hearts of even the boldest. Yet even in their victories, there was a hollow weight. For every fortress razed, every city burned, the price was not only paid by their foes, but by themselves. To wield destruction as one's nature is to be consumed by it, until little remains but the echo of what was once bright. This truth lingered in the songs of the Eldar, who saw beyond the terror to the tragedy hidden within. And though they could not spare themselves the grief of war, they named these beings, not merely as enemies, but as reminders of what might be lost when flame strays into darkness. When Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, was finally overthrown and cast into the void, most of the Balrogs were destroyed or driven into deep hiding. Their numbers dwindled, their glory faded, and the world seemed, for a time, cleansed of their terror. Yet silence does not always mean absence. The mountains, deep and unmeasured, became vaults of forgotten fire. Somewhere beneath the stone, beyond the hearing of men or elves, one of the greatest of their kind slumbered, hidden in the dark roots of the misty mountains. It lay quiet, coiled in shadow, neither dead nor fully awake, but bound in the weight of ages. It is said that flame, when smothered, still lingers in the coal, waiting for the breath that will stir it again. So too with this spirit of fire and shadow. Ages passed like drifting leaves. Kingdoms rose and fell above its resting place. Yet it endured. To those who knew the songs of the First Age, the thought was a distant echo, that not all the servants of Melkor had perished. Perhaps it was a whispered fear, dismissed as legend. Perhaps it was a memory too heavy to bear. Whatever the case, the truth remained hidden, until the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, in their zeal for Mithril, dug ever deeper. But before that tale, we remain here, at the dawn of flame, when these spirits were yet unfallen, when the choice had not yet been sealed. For it is only by remembering what they once were that we may grasp the full measure of what they became. The Balrog of Moria, the demon of shadow and flame, was not born to terror. It was not shaped to ruin. It was a Maya, a spirit of fire, kin in origin to Gandalf and Sauron alike. And in this truth lies the heart of the matter, that the mightiest fall not by accident but by consent, drawn step by step into a path they might once have refused. Thus the first thread is laid, delicate and inevitable, a being of fire, created to serve the music, drawn into discord, chained by its own flame, and buried at last beneath mountains of stone. When we speak of Durin's bane, we are not speaking only of a monster. We are speaking of a choice, multiplied across ages, that lingers in shadow until the world itself must face it. And so the question rises, gently, as night draws in. If such a being was once bright and noble, how did it descend into terror, so complete? What voice carried it from light into flame, from flame into ruin? And more quietly still, what does its story tell us about the nature of fire and of ourselves, who kindle it and fear it in equal measure? The journey to answer begins now, and leads us into the dominion of the first Dark Lord, where shadow was given command of flame, and the servants of Melkor began their long reign of ruin. The tale of flame and shadow cannot remain in its beginning, for to understand the Balrog that slumbered beneath the mountains, we must follow the path of allegiance that bound it to the first Dark Lord. Melkor, greatest of the Valar, stood in defiance of the harmony of the music, and his voice, once glorious, became a summons to rebellion. Those spirits who had turned to him were not compelled by force, but persuaded by the promise of greatness unbound. Among them were the fire spirits who would later be called Balrogs, their essence reshaped by devotion to his cause. They became his captains, wielding the twin powers of terror and flame as extensions of his own will. In the wars of the First Age, they were no longer wandering spirits, but soldiers of a dominion. To the Eldar they were scourges, their whips of fire cracking across battlefields, their towering forms wrapped in dread. Each movement of their darkened wings cast shadows that unnerved armies, not because they were countless in number, but because each carried the weight of inevitability. Against them, courage seemed fragile. To see them upon the field was to feel the memory of light corrupted, to face not only a foe, but a truth, that beings once radiant could choose to stand against the very design that birthed them. Yet the Balrogs themselves were not free. They had exchanged their autonomy for service to a single master. Melkor did not elevate them as equals, but wielded them as instruments. Their fire, once joyous, became a weapon. Their shadows, once a natural veil, became cloaks of domination. They were fierce, but in their ferocity lay enslavement. This paradox defined them. To wield destruction was to be destroyed. To command fear was to live bound in it. They were lieutenants of terror, but never masters of themselves. The Eldar sang of them as great demons, but in their laments lingered sorrow. For the Eldar, who revered memory, understood that the might of the Balrogs was rooted in a tragedy deeper than the sword or flame. Each one was a fallen spirit, a Maya who had chosen the path of ruin. Their power was terrifying, but their loss was immeasurable. To see them was to glimpse the grandeur of what had been, twisted into what now stood before them. Their very presence testified that the music, once harmonious, had been bent into discord. In the great battles of Beleriand, the Balrogs became central figures in Melkor's war. They led assaults against strongholds, broke through lines of defense, and scattered hosts of elves and men alike. At the fall of Gondolin, when towers crumbled and fire consumed the hidden city, it was Balrogs who strode among the ruins, their whips lashing, their shadows swallowing streets and squares. Songs remembered that beneath their blows fell many of the greatest champions of the Eldar. Yet in these tales, there is always a note of foreboding, that each victory deepened their bondage, each triumph drew them further from the freedom they had once embodied. The irony of their service was that the more they raged for Melkor, the less they remained themselves. They became reflections of his will, vessels for his wrath. Where once they might have chosen, now they obeyed. Their individuality faded, their names forgotten, their identities merged into the singular title of Balrog, as though they were no longer spirits, but functions of fear. The very word became a synonym for ruin, their diversity erased beneath the shadow of the master they had chosen. And yet, within their might, there lingered the suggestion of regret. In the songs of the Eldar, it is said that their eyes, though blazing, carried sorrow when seen closely. Whether this was true or only the projection of those who fought them, cannot be known. But it remains a haunting thought, that even in their most terrible hour, some fragment of memory clung to them, recalling what they had once been. This trace of remembrance only deepened the tragedy, for if they still remembered light, their servitude was heavier still. Melkor himself saw them not as companions but as weapons. He unleashed them when terror was needed, held them back when secrecy served. They were the embodiment of his fury, and their loyalty was rewarded only with further chains, for in serving him they had abandoned the possibility of repentance. Unlike others of the Maiar who had turned but later repented, the Balrogs bound themselves utterly. Their identity became inseparable from Melkor's cause, and thus their fate was sealed with his. When at last Melkor was defeated and cast beyond the walls of the world, many of the Balrogs fell in that ruin. Some were hunted down and destroyed by the hosts of the Valar. Others were buried beneath the tumults of earth, entombed by the very mountains they had once strode upon. Few, if any, survived. Yet whispers endured that one or more, hidden deep, had escaped the final reckoning. The fear of such survival haunted memory, a fear that the fire once unleashed is never wholly extinguished. The Balrogs as a host faded into legend, their presence reduced to rumor and shadow. Yet the mark they left upon Middle-earth was indelible. They had demonstrated that corruption could not only twist the small and weak, but also the mighty and radiant. They proved that rebellion against the music was not merely an act of defiance, but a descent into servitude, a surrender to shadow disguised as mastery. And so, when the ages turned and the world seemed to move past the scars of the First Age, their story remained an echo. For if even a fragment of their number endured, it would carry with it the full weight of that ancient tragedy. The earth is vast, the deeps immeasurable, and silence is often the veil of what endures unseen. What became of those spirits buried in shadow was left unanswered, a question deferred but not forgotten. And thus the thread moves forward. If most of the Balrogs were destroyed, and yet whispers tell of one who survived, how did silence preserve such a being? How could a spirit of flame endure through the long ages, unmeasured and unseen? The story now turns from the fields of war to the hush of aftermath, when ruin lay buried, and the world believed it had moved on. But beneath stone and silence, not all fires die. When the First Age closed and the tumult of war subsided, the world seemed at last to breathe in relief. The overthrow of Melkor, had shaken the very foundations of ardor, and the lands bore wounds that would never fully heal. Seas swallowed kingdoms, mountains shifted, and the earth itself seemed to sigh beneath the weight of what had passed. With the fall of the Dark Lord, his servants were scattered, broken or destroyed. The Balrogs, whose whips of flame had once cracked across battlefields, were thought to be ended, and yet history does not erase so easily. Silence came, but silence is not always absent. Among the songs of the Eldar, there lingered whispers that not all of those fiery demons had been destroyed. Some, they said, had fled into the hidden roots of the world, cast down and buried by tumults of stone. The mountains are deep, deeper than even the most daring of miners can fathom, and within their hidden vaults there lies room for both treasure and terror. What is buried is not always dead, and what sleeps does not always fade. Thus, the possibility remained that one or more of those fallen Maya endured, imprisoned not by chains but by silence and stone. The people of later ages did not dwell long on these thoughts, for men short-lived and restless. Such legends became distant tales, stories to frighten children or to lend weight to songs of old. For the dwarves, who looked ever downward with pick and hammer, such memories were shadows too far removed from their own pursuits. Only the elves, long-lived and bound to remembrance, carried these whispers with them. In their counsels and their songs, there persisted a quiet warning that fire, once kindled, never wholly goes out, yet even they, bound by the griefs of the present, allowed that warning to soften into a faint echo. The world seemed changed, the threat ended, and life moved forward. But beneath the surface, deep under roots of mountains and rivers, silence sheltered what could not be wholly extinguished. The spirit of flame and shadow, once fierce upon the fields of Beleriand, now lay dormant. Its power, though dimmed, was not gone. Like coals beneath ash, its essence smoldered, waiting for some tremor, some summons, to stir it from slumber. Time for such a being was not measured in years or centuries, but in ages. What to men would be an eternity was, to a Maya, merely a pause, a dark dream stretching across forgotten centuries. The silence of this dormancy shaped not only the being itself, but also the memory of the world above. The halls of Khazad-dûm, long after, would ring with the laughter and craft of Durin's folk. To them the depths of the mountain were a challenge, not a warning. They dug and sang, built and forged, believing the mountain to be theirs alone. They did not sense, at first, what rested in its roots, for silence does not announce itself, and the shadow that slumbers does not speak until it is stirred. The Eldar, watching from afar, sometimes wondered what might still endure beneath the deep earth. They remembered, better than any others, the ruin wrought by those fiery captains of Melkor. To them the idea of one surviving was both plausible and unbearable, yet time is the great softener of memory. And even among the wise, vigilance grows weary. They did not delve into the misty mountains to confirm their fears. They let the silence stand unchallenged, hoping perhaps that it would remain forever unbroken. And so, an uneasy balance held. The world turned, ages passed, and a shadow in the deep dreamed on. The silence after war is never empty. It is filled with the weight of what has been, and the tension of what might return. The victory of the Valar over Melkor had not eradicated all darkness. It had merely buried it, and buried things, left long enough, may stir again. It is in this silence that the true tragedy of the Balrog deepens. Once a spirit of flame, it now became a prisoner of its own endurance. It was not slain, yet it was not free. It lay hidden, bound by the very stone of the world, forgotten by most, remembered by few. Its slumber was not peace, but waiting. This was its punishment and its doom, to linger without purpose until the deeds of others drew it forth once more. The silence of centuries was its cage, but also its preservation. The dwarves, for their part, thrived in their halls, proud and unknowing. They mined the bright veins of mithril, hammered their forges, and built their vast cities beneath the mountain. To them, the depths of Khazad-dûm were a gift, and they pursued that gift with tireless hands. They did not imagine that in delving so deep they might stir what the world had forgotten. For who would believe that an ancient terror of the First Age lay beneath their feet, waiting? Their songs spoke of stone and metal, not of shadow and flame. Yet the silence itself was fragile, like glass stretched thin over coals. It endured, but it could not endure forever. All silence ends when disturbed, and the deeper it runs, the greater the consequence when it breaks. The Balrog's slumber was not a healing, but a pause, not an end, but a delay. And when the right hand struck stone in the wrong place, the fire beneath would awaken. Thus the Third Age inherited a peril it did not suspect. The men of Gondor, the elves of Lorien, even the wandering peoples of the north, none imagined that within the misty mountains there dwelt a being out of the First Age, a fragment of Melkor's dominion, preserved in darkness. They looked to Sauron, to orcs, to visible enemies, and in doing so, overlooked the silence that hid the greater danger. For silence, though it soothes, also conceals. And so the world moved forward, bearing unknowing within it a smouldering wound. The Balrog of Moria remained unnamed, unseen, a secret beneath the roots of stone. Yet inevitability lingered. The dwarves, in their hunger for wealth, would someday strike too deep, and in doing so break the silence. When that moment came, the world would be reminded that victories do not erase consequences. Thus we arrive at the edge of revelation. The silence after war holds its breath, but cannot hold it forever. The Balrog waits in the dark, a shadow beneath stone, its fire banked but unextinguished. And the question remains, heavy and unspoken. When silence breaks, who will be left to face what rises? The silence of the deeps endured, but silence cannot deter the restless hands of dwarves. In the long memory of Middle-earth, none were as devoted to the craft of delving as Durin's folk, who raised Khazad-dûm into a wonder of stone and light. To them, the mountain was not a prison but a treasure house, and its roots were challenges to be conquered rather than warnings to be heeded. They built vast halls beneath the misty mountains, carving pillars so grand that they seemed like the trunks of stone forests, raising arches that caught the glow of forges and made them shimmer like dawn. Every chisel mark, every hammer strike, echoed with pride and a sense of destiny. Khazad-dûm was more than a city. It was their crown, their heart, their inheritance. During the Deathless was said to have discovered the Mirror, where the stars shone upon the water and reflected the crown of 7 lights above his head. From that omen, the dwarves drew confidence that the mountain was given to them as a gift, a charge, and a home without equal. They delved with a faith that the earth would yield to their determination, for in their song the stone was friend and servant. Each new tunnel, each mined vein of silver or iron, affirmed their mastery. And yet, beneath their triumphs lay an unseen thread of peril, for stone remembers more than it reveals, and the mountains conceal as much as they bestow. Among the veins of iron and silver, they discovered the greatest treasure of all, mithril, a metal unlike any other, light yet strong, radiant yet enduring. It shimmered like moonlight caught in solid form, and its discovery bound the dwarves ever deeper to the roots of the mountain. For mithril was not easily won. It lay buried in the most secret places, hidden beneath ages of rock, as if guarded by the silence itself. Yet the dwarves, driven by wonder and ambition, pressed ever downward. They sang as they worked, and their voices carried through the hollow chambers, filling the dark with a defiance of quiet. Khazad-dûm became renowned among all peoples. Elves marveled at its beauty, and men spoke of its riches with awe. The dwarves themselves walked proudly in their halls, for they had no equal in the making of stone or the delving of mines. The mountains seemed inexhaustible, and their joy seemed secure. Yet even in their greatest pride, the old warnings of the Eldar still lingered like a faint echo. To delve too greedily and too deep was to risk waking what should not be stirred. Few among the dwarfs gave heed to such words, for warnings not rooted in their own labor seemed like shadows cast by other tongues. They trusted their craft, their strength, and their destiny, and in that trust lay the seed of their undoing. The halls of Khazad-dûm, vast as they were, bore within them a certain tension. The deeper the dwarves went, the stranger the stone seemed to grow. The air was heavier, the silence thicker, as though the mountain itself grew wary. Some among them muttered that the echoes of their picks sounded different, as if striking against hollows too vast for the eye to see. Others claimed that in the deepest delves, the shadows seemed to linger longer, as though reluctant to retreat from torchlight. Such murmurs were not sung into the great halls, but spoken quietly, in the corners of forges, before being dismissed with laughter. Yet the truth was simple. Their delving pressed close to secrets older than their kingdom. Beneath their feet lay chambers untouched, since the world was first shaped, vaults of silence where the ruin of another age still slumbered. And though the dwarves did not know it, each swing of the hammer, each tunnel carved, brought them nearer to the chamber where shadow slept. Their pride blinded them, and their ambition hastened them. For Mithril was not only beauty but wealth and power, and with each fragment drawn forth, their hunger for more deepened. Durin's folk had always been proud, but pride without limit becomes peril. The richness of Khazad-dûm was both gift and lure, a promise that demanded more than it offered. To the dwarves, the mountains seemed endless, yet, in truth, they were approaching a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. The Balrog beneath was not a guardian placed there by chance. It was a remnant of rebellion, buried by the ruin of an earlier age, and the silence that held it was as fragile as glass. It is said that in those days the dwarves felt themselves at the height of fortune. Their halls glowed with the fires of smithies, their arms gleamed with mithril, and their voices echoed in song. They welcomed elves and traded with men, their doors open, their pride secure. No shadow yet darkened their gates, and so they believed that nothing could. But the very brightness of their prosperity masked the depth of their approach to doom. For silence does not break in haste, it waits until the last strike, the final breach, the moment when greed and fate meet. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm did not know it, but each day of triumph carried them closer to the awakening of their bane. The Balrog lay coiled beneath, patient in its slumber, its essence smoldering like hidden coal. Ages had passed, but time had no hold on such a being. It waited, and the dwarves in their eagerness drew nearer without ever knowing what they sought. Thus the story of Khazad-dûm is told, not only as a tale of glory, but as a caution. The grandeur of its halls, the brilliance of its treasures, the pride of its people, all were real, yet within them moved the shadow of consequence. The silence that had shielded the world since the fall of Melkor was not eternal, and in the eagerness of Durin's folk, that silence trembled. And so the question lingers, delicate and heavy as the air in their deepest tunnels. When stone yields too much, when fire is touched unbidden, what awakens? What price is demanded for treasures that lie too far below? The sound of pick and hammer, steady and unrelenting, carried deeper into the mountain than the dwarves of Durin could imagine, through strata of rock older than memory, through caverns untouched since the shaping of the world. The echoes rolled until at last they stirred something that had slept for longer than the measure of men's kingdoms. Silence, stretched across ages, does not break suddenly. It frays at the edges, shivers with faint tremors, and then, with one final breach, it collapses into awakening. So it was when the dwarves delved into the deepest veins of Mithril, their lights flickering against stone that had not known illumination since the world was young. What they uncovered was not only treasure, but consequence. In that moment, the last great Balrog stirred from its uneasy sleep. It had lain coiled beneath the mountain since the ruin of the First Age, buried in the collapse of Morgoth's dominion, surviving not through strength of will alone, but through the simple endurance of its kind. It was a Maya still, a spirit of fire cloaked in shadow, though diminished by ages of silence. Yet within its being burned a power undimmed, a hunger for dominion, a wrath that had never cooled. The first breath it drew shook the stone. The first motion of its limbs sent dust cascading from the cavern ceiling. The mountain shuddered as if in recognition, as though stone itself remembered what it had once entombed. The dwarves who stood nearest to that place did not survive to tell what they saw, for when the Balrog rose, it was not with hesitation, but with the inevitability of flame reclaiming a wick. It came forth as shadow before fire, a towering form wreathed in darkness, its heat scorching the very air. To the dwarves, proud and fearless though they were, the sight was terror beyond telling. Their songs had spoken of dragons, of orcs, of foes countless and cruel, but nothing in their memory prepared them for this. This was no beast of the earth, no creature bound by flesh and bone. This was a spirit clothed in flame, wrath, and will given form, the ruin of an age long forgotten. The awakening was not an accident, nor a punishment placed by chance. It was the cost hidden within the gift of Mithril. In seeking too deep, the dwarves had brushed against the silence that guarded a fragment of the First Age, and the silence had given way. What rose against them was not merely an enemy, but the past itself. Remembrance turned to fire, consequence given shape. The Balrog that emerged was called Durin's Bane, though the name was not yet spoken. It came forth not to conquer, not to build dominion, but simply to endure, to burn, to scatter the living from the stone it claimed as its own. During the sixth fell before it, and his folk were thrown into grief. His son Nain the First followed soon after, struck down as the Balrog claimed the depth. To the dwarves, it was more than the loss of kings, it was the breaking of certainty, the shattering of pride. Khazad-dûm, their greatest work, the marvel of their craft, was no longer theirs. The halls that had rung with song became tombs. The forges that had glowed with fire were darkened, and the pillars that had stood like forests of stone became silent markers of absence. The Balrog did not need to destroy all. It needed only to be. Its presence alone was conquest. Word spread slowly, for the dwarves spoke little of what had occurred. To admit the truth was to admit defeat beyond remedy, and their grief was heavy. They called the creature Durin's Bane, and that name alone carried weight enough to silence questions. The elves, hearing whispers of what had awakened, remembered with dread. They knew, as others did not, the nature of what had risen. For to them the memory of the Balrogs was not legend but history, and the thought that one endured was terror clothed in sorrow. They spoke of Khazad-dûm no more, calling it Moria, the Black Pit, a name of absence, a wound in stone. The Balrog, for its part, did not march forth to conquer the wide world. It remained within the mountain, a shadow enthroned in silence, and that was enough. Its existence made Khazad-dûm uninhabitable. Orcs and creatures of darkness crept into its edges, emboldened by the presence of a terror older and greater than themselves. Yet even they did not dwell near its heart, for the Balrog was not companion but dread, and even servants of shadow knew to fear it. The mountain became a husk, inhabited by echoes and crawling with lesser evils, yet ruled in truth by a single being of flame and ruin. Thus, in one awakening, the fate of Durin's folk was forever altered. They wandered, seeking new homes, building new halls, but none equaled the grandeur of Khazad-dûm. Their songs, once proud with triumph, grew heavy with lament. They did not forget the treasure of Mithril, nor the halls of their fathers, but they remembered also the cost. Their grief became part of their identity, their wandering a reminder that pride is fragile, and stone may conceal more than riches. The awakening of the Balrog also served as a lesson to others, though few fully grasped it, for it showed that the past, even when buried, endured. The victories of old did not erase what had been wrought. They merely pressed it beneath the surface, where it lingered until chance or will disturbed it. The Balrog's return was not the rise of a new evil, but the reappearance of an old one, a reminder that nothing in Arda is ever wholly forgotten. Fire, once kindled, always leaves embers, and embers may smolder for ages before flame return. Durin's bane became legend, but not legend in the sense of fading into story. It was a living legend, inhabiting stone and shadow, proof that ancient choices echo forward. To the dwarves it was grief. To the elves it was warning. To men it was rumor, half believed and half doubted. Yet to all it was a sign that the deep places of the world are not empty, and that delving too far into silence invites consequence. The Balrog did not seek renown, yet renown clung to it. Its very stillness within Moria was enough to spread fear across Middle-earth. Few dared approach the Black Pit, and those who did rarely returned. It had no need to wage war. Its presence alone was ruin, and so it remained, the embodiment of what lies beneath pride, beneath ambition, beneath stone, the quiet truth that the past, however deeply buried, will not remain silent forever. And so we arrive at the next thread. If the Balrog of Moria endured in its dark dominion, why was it not destroyed? What shield of circumstance, what weight of fate, allowed it to linger across ages, unchallenged and unbroken, until the Fellowship itself walked beneath those halls? In the ages that followed the awakening, Khazad-dûm was no longer a city of light and laughter, but a hollow wound beneath the mountain. The Balrog did not stride forth as conqueror, nor raise banners as Morgoth once had. It did not need to. Its very presence was dominion enough, a weight upon the stone that turned vast halls into graves. Shadow pooled in corners where once lanterns had glowed. Fires guttered out in forges that had once burned bright with the shaping of Mithril. What had been pride became silence, and what had been silence became fear. The Balrog ruled without ruling, its essence seeping into every echoing passage. The dwarves who had survived their first encounter fled, carrying grief heavier than their packs. They left behind treasures beyond reckoning, vaults filled with the labors of centuries, for not even the richest hoard could outweigh the terror of what remained. They did not speak openly of the creature, naming it Durin's bane, as if that single title could contain the vastness of their loss. In exile they remembered Khazad-dûm as it had been, yet always with the shadow of what dwelt there now. The Black Pit, they called it, a name of absence, as though even to describe what had driven them out was to lend it strength. The Balrog itself did not pursue them. It did not march to their new halls, nor strike down their wandering kin. It stayed in the mountain, still as coals buried in ash, and yet its presence alone cast a shadow far beyond the stones that enclosed it. For Khazad-dûm was no longer a refuge to any who sought it. Rumors spread of strange fires in the deeps, of shadows that moved though no torch was borne. Miners who strayed too close did not return, and orcs who crept into its borders often fled again, whispering of a terror that even they could not name. In this way, the Balrog conquered without leaving its throne of silence. Orcs and other creatures of darkness did take root in the upper halls and surrounding tunnels, emboldened by the certainty that the dwarves would not return. Yet even they gave wide berth to the deepest chambers. They feared the tremor in the air, the whisper of heat in the walls, the sense that to walk too near was to be noticed by something vast and unseen. For though the Balrog did not strike needlessly, it struck surely, and none who felt its lash endured. Thus it ruled not as a king with servants, but as a fire in the hearth of shadow, shaping the very atmosphere of the mountain into dread. The elves of Lorien and Rivendell remembered the ancient wars. To them, the whispers that one of the fiery captains still endured were more than rumor. They knew too well the nature of such beings, and they trembled at the thought that the ruin of the First Age had endured into the Third. Yet they did not march against it, nor call upon the Valar to cleanse the mountain, for they understood that such a spirit, once stirred, could not be easily overcome. To face it was to awaken a memory that could consume more than stone. Better, they thought, to let it remain entombed, bound not by chains, but by its own stillness. Thus Middle-earth lived for centuries with a paradox. A great terror sat at the heart of the misty mountains, and yet it did not act. It did not conquer lands, did not enslave peoples, did not seek dominion as Sauron did. It remained, and its remaining was enough. Its silence was as deadly as armies, for it transformed Khazad-dûm from jewel to void, from city to legend. The dwarves wandered in exile, diminished in pride, while the elves kept watch at a distance, knowing that some old fire still smoldered. Men, shorter-lived and prone to forgetfulness, regarded the tales as half-truths, campfire warnings rather than warnings rooted in history. But history does not fade because mortals dismiss it. History waits. The halls of Moria grew darker with each passing age. Dripping water echoed in chambers once filled with song. Dust lay thick on stone tables where once feasts had been set. The carvings of Durin's folk, proud and intricate, became monuments to absence. Orcs scratched their own crude marks over pillars and gates, as if defacing beauty could disguise the fear that clung to them. Yet the deeper vaults remained untouched, for none dared stir the heat that lingered in their walls. And so, within the stone heart of the mountain, the Balrog remained enthroned, unseen yet sovereign. To some, it may seem strange that a being of such might did not stride forth to claim dominion. Yet its very nature was paradoxical. A Maya, once radiant, now chained by shadow and flame. Its will was strong, but it was bound to the ruin it had embraced. It could not be other than it was, a scourge, a bane, a remnant of rebellion. To rule beyond the mountain was not its fate. Its dominion was silence, its realm absence, its throne the hollowness left where life had been. And perhaps that was its punishment as well as its power, to remain in the ruins of greatness, to endure without purpose, to smolder without release. Durin's bane did not hunger for conquest. It was conquest embodied, the very memory of rebellion given form. Its presence transformed Khazad-dûm into Moria, its silence speaking more loudly than words or armies. For centuries, none disturbed it, and it did not disturb others. But silence, however deep, is always fragile. Sooner or later, footsteps would echo in those halls again. Sooner or later the world above would forget or dismiss the warnings, and the deep fire would stir. The Balrog's reign was not measured in battles but in centuries of absence. It shaped history, not through deeds but through the spaces it hollowed, the voids it created. And yet the longer it endured, the heavier the weight of its presence became. For in every whisper of Moria, in every lament of the dwarves, in every cautious glance of the elves toward the misty mountains, its shadow stretched further. It did not need to move to remind the world that the past had not ended. And so the question lingered, quietly pressing upon those who still remembered. If the Balrog remained, why did no one act? Why was such a terror permitted to endure unchallenged in the heart of Middle-earth? Was it fear or wisdom or the quiet recognition that to strike at ancient fire is to risk being consumed by it? The silence that lingered within the halls of Moria was not complete, for memory is its own kind of sound, and among the elves it endured like a song sung in hushed voices. They remembered the first age more vividly than any others, and with it the terror of flame and shadow that had walked in the service of Morgoth. For them, the whispers that one of those beings still dwelt beneath the mountains were not idle tales, but recollections sharpened by grief. To forget was impossible, to speak too often of it was unbearable, and so their remembrance endured in fragments, woven into counsel, preserved in lament, carried in the fading threads of song. In Rivendell, where lore was gathered and guarded, the memory of Balrogs was spoken of with reverence and dread. Elrond, who had himself seen the ruin of Beleriand, knew that such a creature could not be lightly dismissed. When word reached him, across centuries, that Khazad-dûm had fallen not to orc or dragon but to something unnamed, he needed no further proof. He understood what the dwarves could not bring themselves to declare openly. Durin's bane, the shadow in Moria, was a relic of the elder days, one of the great captains of fire, who had followed Morgoth into ruin. His counsel was quiet but unwavering. None should seek to reclaim those halls while that darkness remained. In Lothlorien, Galadriel too remembered. She had crossed into Middle-earth in the First Age, and seen its wars unfold. To her, the presence of such a being was a wound in the world, a reminder that the long shadow of rebellion was never wholly ended. She did not speak of it often, but in her gaze the truth was clear. She feared not only for the dwarves who had lost their home, but for all who lived in the shadow of the misty mountains. For the Balrog was not merely a threat to stone or people, it was a sign that the ancient discord of Melkor still pulsed in the veins of the world. Among the elves, memory itself became a shield. They taught their young of what had been, warning them not to mistake silence for safety. Their songs of the Balrogs were not triumphant, for even the victories of the First Age had been steeped in grief. Instead, they sang laments of heroes who had fallen, of cities consumed, of fire that devoured light. These songs, though sorrowful, were warnings as well, reminders that the deep places of the earth were not to be trusted, that beneath stone still lurked the remnants of battles, thought long ended. To remember was to endure, and to endure was to resist. Yet memory is fragile. To men whose lives were brief and whose histories stretched only a little way, the tales of Balrog seemed distant, mythic, too vast to be real. They heard the elves speak of fire demons and shadowed captains, but to them it was as if one were describing the storms of creation, events too remote to matter. Their concern lay with nearer perils, with wars among themselves, with the rise of Sauron, with the fleeting troubles of kingdoms that flourished and fell within centuries. Thus, as memory faded among men, the Balrog of Moria slipped into legend, a half-believed terror that belonged more to story than to warning. The dwarves, though closer to the truth, bore their knowledge in silence. They spoke little of Durin's bane, for their grief was heavy and their pride wounded. To admit what had cast them out was to confess a defeat deeper than loss of home. They remembered, but they did not declare. Their silence left space for the legends to soften, for the truth to be doubted. Only in their laments sung in halls far from Moria did the truth echo, that they had delved too deep and in so doing had wakened an ancient foe. Thus the elves alone held memory with clarity. In their councils they spoke of the shadow that still burned in the heart of the mountain, and they shaped their choices around it. They knew that should any power arise in the east, the presence of the Balrog in the center of Middle-earth would remain a peril, yet even they, wise and long-lived, did not act against it. For they remembered the cost of such battle. To face a Balrog was to risk ruin, to awaken flame that could not be contained without grievous loss. Their memory was not only knowledge, it was restraint. But memory is not the same as vigilance, and vigilance can falter. As ages passed, the songs grew fainter, the counsel less urgent. To the young among the elves who had not seen the first age, the Balrog was a story born on the voices of their elders, heavy with sorrow but distant. They could not grasp the full weight of a being who had seen the music of creation twisted into discord. They could not feel the terror that had broken armies. They knew only that there was a shadow in Moria, and that it was not to be disturbed. In this way, even among the elves, remembrance grew more fragile. And so the world approached a moment of inevitable meeting, when the fading of memory among men, the silence of the dwarves, and the weariness of the elves would converge. The Fellowship of the Ring, seeking passage, would step into halls where memory was not enough to shield them. The songs that had warned of fire and shadow would echo faintly, but not loudly enough to prevent their steps. The shadow that had waited in silence would rise again, no longer as a forgotten remnant but as a present terror. The question then was never whether the Balrog endured, for the elves had always known that it did. The question was who would be forced to face it, and what would be lost in that encounter. Memory had preserved the truth, but memory alone cannot turn back fate. It can only prepare those who listen. The tragedy lay in this, that many no longer listened, and those who did could not prevent what must come. The company of the Ring came to the threshold of Khazad-dûm, not with triumph, but with necessity. Snow and stone had barred their passage over Kararas, the cruel mountain casting them back with storms more relentless than any blade. Forced from the heights, they turned their eyes to the black gates of Moria, a path none desired yet none could deny. The choice lay heavy, for the name itself was a shadow. Moria, the Black Pit, a place of silence and rumor. The elves remembered what dwelt within. The dwarves bore the grief of their lost city, and men whispered of perils unseen. Yet between pursuit from behind and impassable peaks before them, the Fellowship pressed forward into the dark that had claimed Durin's folk. The doors of stone, once wrought with craft and beauty, stood weathered and worn, their inscriptions dimmed by time. To pass them was to step not only into shadow, but into history. The words that opened them were not words of battle, but of friendship between elf and dwarf, a reminder of days when Khazad-dûm had been bright with trade and song. Yet that memory seemed fragile now, as if the mountain itself had swallowed it. When the waters outside stirred with sudden malice, when coils and limbs from the deep rose to bar their retreat, the company was driven inward. The choice was sealed, the doors shut behind them, and Moria received them. Within, silence reigned. Their footsteps rang against stone floors where once thousands had walked. Great halls stretched into shadow, their vast pillars like trees in a forest of rock, their heights so immense that torchlight could not find their crowns. The company moved slowly, their voices hushed, for the air itself seemed thick with watching. Dust lay upon the stones, yet not all was still. Scraps of debris, marks upon walls, and the bones of long-dead dwarves bore witness to the battles fought when Khazad-dûm fell. Orcs had come after Durin's bane awoke, and their presence still clung to the ruins. The company could sense it, though they had not yet seen it. Gimli walked with reverence and sorrow, his voice breaking as he named the glories of what once had been. He saw not only ruin, but memory, the forges of his kin, the carvings of stone that bore their pride, the chambers where their kings had ruled. For him, each step was a lament. To others, it was awe. To walk through Khazad-dûm was to walk through a city unlike any other, a place where stone had been made to sing. Yet beneath awe lay unease, and beneath unease lay dread. For though the company had not yet spoken it aloud, they walked toward the heart of the mountain, where shadow had dwelt since ages uncounted. The days within were heavy, each step drawing them deeper. They rested in side chambers, ate sparingly, and whispered by firelight, their words hushed by the weight of the silence. Even the hobbits, whose voices often rose in laughter or complaint, grew subdued. Only Gandalf seemed steady, his staff alight in the dark, his eyes filled with remembrance of deeper things. He walked as one who knew that the shadows around them were not merely absence, but presence. He alone sensed more clearly what might stir. At last they came upon Balin's tomb, a stone chamber where grief was carved into every wall. The dwarves had once tried to reclaim Khazad-dûm, driven by pride and longing, but their attempt had ended in slaughter. The company stood before the white stone, and Gimli wept. The silence of that chamber was broken only by the reading of names, and the weight of futility pressed upon them. What had been lost could not be regained. Moria was no home now, but a grave, and every step further was a trespass deeper into the realm of absence. Yet the mountain did not let them go in peace. Orcs came, drawn by the noise of strangers, their drums echoing in the deeps, a sound like the heartbeat of stone. The company fought, blades flashing in the dark, arrows striking sparks against shields. Yet even amid the clash, something greater stirred. The drums did not belong only to orcs, and the fear that crept into their foes was not caused by men or hobbits or even the wizard who stood against them. Something deeper awoke at the sound of battle, something older than any orc. The earth itself trembled faintly, as if in remembrance. The fellowship pressed forward, fleeing through halls vast and empty, their hearts racing with the beat of drums that would not cease. The stone groaned around them, the air grew heavy with heat, and shadows thickened at their heels. They did not yet see it, but they felt it, the sense of pursuit not by orcs alone, but by a presence vast and dreadful. The hobbits clutched their breath. Legolas glanced over his shoulder with fear he did not name, and Gimli muttered words of grief and defiance. Gandalf walked with a gravity that none could mistake, for he alone knew what it was that the darkness concealed, what fire might stride again in the halls of Khazad. The bridge of Khazad-dûm lay ahead, a narrow crossing over a chasm so deep that light itself seemed to fail before touching its depths. Yet even before they reached it, the fellowship heard the sound that froze them in their tracks, a roar that was both flame and shadow, a cry that seemed to echo from the first age itself. In that moment, they knew the stories were true. This was no rumor, no whispered warning half remembered by elves. This was the terror itself, risen again in fire. They ran, yet the presence drew closer. Heat grew upon their backs. Light flickered behind them, though no torch burned, and the stone seemed to tremble beneath each step. The shadow in pursuit was not like orc or troll. It was vast, inexorable, inevitable. Even without sight, they knew what it was. And Gandalf, turning, spoke the words that none wished to hear, but all understood, that a Balrog of Morgoth pursued them. Thus the Fellowship, bound by necessity into Moria, came face to face with the ancient past. The silence that had endured for ages broke upon them, not with warning but with flame. The question was no longer whether the Balrog endured, it was what would be required to pass beyond it, and who among them would bear that cost. The company had fled through endless halls, their breath ragged, their footsteps echoing against stone that seemed to mourn with them. Orcs swarmed like shadows given flesh, their cries filling every corridor, their drums still pounding as though the mountain itself had grown a heartbeat. Yet all this tumult, dreadful though it was, became insignificant when the true sound rose above it, the roar of something vast, a cry of fire and shadow that seemed to shake the bones of the world. It was no beast of flesh that pursued them now, but a memory given form, a terror from the first age awakened into the third. The Balrog had risen, and Moria trembled beneath its steps. When at last the Fellowship glimpsed it, awe and dread struck them silent. From behind a wall of orcs it came, vast and terrible, a figure that seemed both substance and absence, its form wreathed in fire yet cloaked in shadow, so deep that the flames seemed almost swallowed within it. Its head nearly brushed the cavern vaults, its arms long and sinewed, bearing a whip of flame that cracked and writhed like a living serpent. The heat that radiated from it scorched the air, making it hard to breathe, while its shadow fell upon all who beheld it, pressing against their hearts like the weight of despair. To look upon it was to see not only a creature, but a history, the ruin of cities, the fall of heroes, the memory of wars. Thought ended. Legolas faltered, his bow lowering, his eyes wide in horror, for to him the Balrogs were not legend, but lived remembrance carried by his people's song. Gimli trembled with rage and sorrow, for this was the bane of his house, the destroyer of Khazad-dûm, the terror that had driven his folk into exile. Even the hobbits, who knew nothing of the First Age, felt the truth in their bones. This was no enemy they could comprehend or resist. Only Gandalf stood unmoved, his staff planted before him, his gaze steady as though he had long awaited this moment. The orcs themselves fled before the creature, scattering like dry leaves before fire. Their drums ceased, their cries fell silent, for they knew the presence of their master's master, a terror greater than any they could serve. In that instant the Fellowship understood that the orcs had been but the heralds of something far worse. The real danger was not in their numbers, but in the single figure now advancing through the dark, each step shaking the stone as though the mountain bowed beneath it. The company ran, driven forward by fear more primal than thought. Across vast halls and twisting corridors they fled, hearing always the crack of the whip behind them, the roar of fire, the steady advance of inevitability. Yet no matter how swift their steps, the presence pressed closer. The mountain seemed smaller around it, its pillars bending inward, its arches narrowing, until all the vastness of Khazad-dûm felt like a funnel leading to the single place where confrontation must occur. The bridge of Khazad-dûm lay ahead, narrow and perilous, a span of stone over an abyss without end. There, at the very edge of shadow and flame, they turned, and the Balrog was revealed in full. Fire flared along its limbs, its whip cracked with a noise like thunder, and in its other hand it raised a sword of flame, vast and terrible. Its eyes glowed with coals of hatred, yet deeper than hatred there burned something older, the sorrow of rebellion, the pride of a Maya fallen beyond recall. To face it was to face not only destruction, but the truth of what had been lost when fire chose shadow. The hobbits clung to one another, terror freezing their limbs, Boromir raised his shield, though his eyes betrayed the futility of the gesture. Aragorn stepped forward, hand on his sword, his face grim, yet even he knew this was no foe to be overcome by steel. Legolas nocked an arrow, but did not release it, for what weapon of wood or metal could pierce flame and darkness woven together? Only Gandalf stepped fully forward, placing himself between the Fellowship and the demon. He stood upon the bridge, his staff glowing faintly, his voice calm though the abyss yawned beneath him. The Balrog halted at the far side, as though recognizing in Gandalf a kinship deeper than that of foe and foe. For both were Maiar, spirits of the same origin, though one had remained faithful and the other had fallen. In that silent recognition, the cavern seemed to hold its breath. Then the Balrog advanced, slow and inevitable, its sword blazing, its whip lashing sparks against the stone. The air grew hotter, the shadows deeper, until the company could hardly see for the brightness of fire and the thickness of dark. Gandalf's voice rang out, steady and commanding, words of defiance echoing against the walls. Yet his voice was not only command, it was sorrow, the recognition of what he faced, for he knew the nature of this foe, knew that the creature before him was no beast but a spirit of flame twisted into ruin. He did not face only fire and shadow, he faced the cost of rebellion, the memory of ages long past. The Fellowship could not know the full weight of this, but they felt it in the silence that clung to Gandalf's words, in the heaviness of the moment that stretched between them and the abyss. The Balrog answered not with words but with flame. Its sword crashed down, its whip lashed outward, its roar shook the bridge. Stone cracked, sparks flew, and the air burned. The Fellowship could not bear to watch, yet they could not look away. The clash was more than battle. It was history colliding with the present, memory striking against hope. Gandalf's staff flared with light. His sword gleamed, and for a moment shadow and flame contended against the brightness of steadfast will. The company fled as commanded, running across the narrow span, their hearts pounding with grief and fear. Behind them, the roar of the Balrog and the steady defiance of Gandalf filled the cavern. They did not yet know the cost, but they knew it must be paid, for the presence of the Balrog was not something that could be avoided. It was something that demanded confrontation, demanded a stand. Thus the shadow and flame, once buried in silence, now strode again into the sight of Middle-earth. The Fellowship, fleeing into the lightless deeps, knew that their journey had crossed a threshold. Whatever awaited beyond, the past had risen to meet them, and it demanded a reckoning. The bridge stretched narrow across the abyss, a thread of stone suspended over darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The Fellowship had fled across its span, driven by the cries of their guide and the terror that thundered behind them. But Gandalf alone remained, his staff planted firmly before him, his cloak stirring in the heat that rolled forward like a tide. Before him loomed the Balrog, advancing with fire in one hand and shadow in the other, a being vast enough to fill the cavern with its presence. Their confrontation was not only a clash of power, but of memory. Two Maiar of the same origin, one uncorrupted, the other consumed. The air shimmered with the heat of the Balrog's approach. Sparks rained from its whip as it cracked against the stone, each lash striking like thunder. The flames of its sword blazed brighter than any forge fire, casting jagged shadows across the pillars that lined the cavern. Its roar was a chorus of all the battles it had fought, of all the ruin it had wrought, a sound that carried the grief of the First Age into the Third. Yet Gandalf did not flinch. His voice rose steady and calm, words of command ringing against the hollow air, declaring that the demon would not pass. The Balrog slowed, its eyes like twin furnaces fixed upon him. In those fiery depths burned more than hatred. There was recognition, a dim awareness of kinship twisted into opposition. For both had been present at the music, both had once sung in harmony before discord broke the song. One had chosen faithfulness, the other rebellion, and now upon this narrow bridge their paths converged. The fellowship, though fleeing, felt the weight of that moment press upon them. They looked back once, seeing wizard and demon face one another across the stone span, and they knew this was no ordinary battle but a reckoning written across ages. The Balrog struck first. Its sword of flame descended, cleaving the air with heat, so fierce it scorched the stone beneath. Gandalf raised his own blade, glandering, and the clash rang like a bell struck in the deeps. Light met fire, and sparks showered into the abyss. The Balrog pressed forward, each strike of its weapon sending tremors through the bridge. Gandalf gave ground, but did not falter, his staff glowing with white fire, his face set with the gravity of one who bore not only the burden of battle but of choice. For he knew that to stand here was to risk all, yet to yield was to surrender the fellowship to flame. The demon's whip lashed outward, wrapping around pillars, tearing stone from their bases. The crack of it echoed like a storm breaking across mountains. Yet Gandalf stood, his staff raised, his words ringing once more, and the whip recoiled as though stung. Fire seared his cloak, shadow pressed close, but his light endured, steady and unwavering. His defiance was not loud but absolute, a quiet authority that spoke of strength deeper than power alone. The bridge itself groaned beneath the strain of their clash, dust falling into the abyss. Yet still they fought, each blow an echo of ancient rebellion, each cry a fragment of the music, now turned to discord and resistance. The fellowship had reached the far side, but they lingered in horror, unable to tear their eyes away. Aragorn held Frodo back as he tried to step forward, for he too felt the pull of despair at leaving their guide alone. Boromir's shield trembled in his hand, Legolas's bow hung useless at his side. Gimli clenched his axe with white-knuckled rage, yet none could intervene, for this was no fight of mortals. This was kin against kin, a contest beyond the reach of sword or arrow. Their task was to flee, though every instinct urged them to remain. The Balrog pressed harder, its full form revealed upon the bridge, its wings of shadow unfurled, vast and dreadful, their darkness sweeping across the cavern, as though to extinguish all light. The flames of its body leapt higher, a furnace unchained, and its roar shook dust from the ceilings above. Gandalf lifted his staff high, its light flaring against the gloom, casting long shadows that wavered like ghosts. His words rose once more, not only defiance, but judgment. The bridge would not bear the weight of the demon's advance. The stone cracked. The narrow span trembled beneath the Balrog's step, fissures racing outward from its feet. Gandalf struck the bridge with his staff, and light flashed as stone split. The span beneath the Balrog gave way, collapsing into the abyss with a roar of falling rock. For a moment the demon plunged downward, its form swallowed by the chasm. Flames streaked against the walls as it fell, its roar echoing into endless depth. The fellowship cried out in relief, believing the terror ended. Gandalf stood upon the edge, staff still in hand, weary but unbowed, his figure etched against the glow of his own light. But fire does not fall without grasping what it can. The whip of the Balrog cracked upward as it plummeted, its fiery lash curling about Gandalf's legs. With a sudden pull, the wizard was dragged toward the abyss. His staff clattered upon the stone as he clung for a brief instant to the edge, his eyes meeting those of his companions. His voice rose one final time, urgent yet calm, commanding them to flee. And then the lash tightened, and he was pulled into the dark. The fellowship cried out in grief, their voices echoing in the hollow cavern. Frodo's scream pierced the silence. Aragorn's face blanched with horror. Boromir's shield struck the stone in helpless fury. Yet none could act, for the moment was gone. Gandalf had fallen, drawn into the abyss with the demon, their battle not ended but carried into depths unseen. The bridge lay broken, the fellowship stood bereft, and silence returned, heavier now than any shadow. They fled, driven by grief as much as by necessity, their hearts breaking with every step. Behind them the abyss yawned, and within it fire still smouldered. Gandalf and the Balrog were gone, yet their struggle was not ended. In the deeps beneath the mountain, flame and shadow would contend with light unseen by mortal eyes, yet decisive in the story that unfolded. For what had begun upon the bridge was not conclusion, but passage into a struggle beyond sight. And so the fellowship pressed on, burdened by loss, yet bound by necessity. Ahead lay their road, uncertain and perilous, but behind them remained a truth they could not escape. The Balrog of Moria had risen, and though it had fallen into the abyss, it had not fallen alone. Into the abyss they fell, wizard and demon together, swallowed by a darkness so profound that even flame seemed smothered by its depth. Yet the fire did not go out. The Balrog plummeted with a roar that shook the roots of the mountain, its body wreathed in flame, its shadow stretching like vast wings against the cavern walls. Gandalf fell with it, clutched in the lash of its whip, his body battered by stone, his staff lost to the void. The air screamed past them, the walls a blur of rushing stone, until the gulf opened wider still, and they crashed into waters blacker than night. The lake at the mountain's roots quenched the flame, but not the spirit. Steam rose in pillars, hissing and boiling, as shadow and light contended in the drowned deeps. For long hours they battled in darkness beneath the earth. The Balrog's fire hissed and sputtered, its body cloaked now in shadow more than flame, yet its strength was not diminished. It struck with claws like molten iron, with a whip that cracked even in the choking waters. Gandalf withstood its fury, his blade flashing with pale fire, his voice rising in words that broke the stillness of the cavern. Around them the black lake churned, waves crashing against walls unseen by mortal eyes. The waters themselves seemed to recoil from the fury of their struggle, as if unwilling to contain such ancient wrath. They fought from the depths to the dark shores of that hidden lake, and from there into the winding tunnels that led ever upward. The Balrog fled through passages that had not known sound since the shaping of the mountains, and Gandalf pursued. The chase was endless, a journey through stone that seemed to stretch beyond the reckoning of time. Fire returned to the Balrog as it climbed, its flames rekindled with each stride, its shadow lengthening across the walls. Gandalf's light followed, steady and relentless, two powers locked in a struggle older than the world they now traversed. The tunnels opened into caverns, vast and terrible, where the roof stretched so high that their combat lit it faintly, like lightning flashing against clouds. Pillars of stone loomed in silence, their roots sunk deep into the mountain, their crowns lost in darkness. Here they battled again, their strikes shaking dust from the vaults above, their roars echoing like thunder across plains of stone. The Balrog's whip tore through columns, bringing them down in shattering ruin. Yet still Gandalf advanced, his sword biting through flame and shadow alike. The ground quaked, cracks opened, and rivers of fire burst forth from hidden veins, as though the mountain itself mirrored their fury. Through passage and cavern, over chasms and across bridges long forgotten, the struggle carried on. Neither rested, neither relented. The Balrog pressed ever upward, as though some memory of the heights, some yearning for the open air, drove it from the deeps. Gandalf pursued not only to prevent its escape, but because he knew the truth. If such a being broke free into the wide lands once more, its ruin would be beyond measure. The mountain groaned with each clash, its roots trembling, as though Ardor itself recognized the weight of what unfolded within it. At last, after days uncounted, their battle reached the high places of the world. The tunnels opened upon the icy crown of Xeraxigil, where wind tore across stone and sky, stretched endless above. Snow lay upon the peaks, yet it melted where the Balrog stepped, steam rising as its fire burned through the frost. Here, at the pinnacle of the mountain, their struggle reached its final fury. The Balrog rose to its full height, vast and terrible, its flames leaping high into the thin air, its whip cracking against the stone with thunderous force. Gandalf stood before it, his cloak torn, his body weary, yet his eyes shone with a light that even shadow could not dim. Upon that mountain-top they clashed once more. The Balrog's sword of flame blazed against the white fire of Gandalf's blade. Sparks showered into the wind, carried away to vanish in the abyss below. The demon's shadows swept outward, blackening the snow, while Gandalf's light pressed back against it, the two forces contending beneath the cold heavens. Their battle was not swift, for each strike carried the weight of ages. Each cry echoed with memory of what they once had been. Fire against flame, shadow against light, rebellion against faith. They contended until the mountain itself trembled beneath them. The Balrog's strength was vast, its fury unending. It hurled boulders, shattered stone, tore rifts in the mountain, and yet Gandalf did not yield. His voice rose with words of command, and the winds themselves seemed to answer. Lightning flared, striking the peak, illuminating for a heartbeat the struggle of Maya against Maya. The Balrog roared, its whip lashing, its fire surging higher. Gandalf stood unbroken, each stroke of his blade pressing further, each step driving the demon back. Their battle raged upon the summit, a storm of flame and shadow against wind and light, until at last the mountain could bear no more. The peak split, fire bursting upward from within, snow and stone hurled into the sky. Upon that shattered crown, Gandalf struck his final blow. Glamdring pierced through flame and shadow, and the Balrog fell, its roar echoing into the valleys below, as it was cast down from the heights. Its body crashed upon the rocks, shattering them, its fire extinguished at last, its shadow dissolving into the wind. The terror of Durin's bane was ended, not by flight, not by silence, but by the final reckoning of battle. Yet Gandalf too lay upon the broken peak, his body spent, his strength consumed. He had pursued through deeps and caverns, through fire and shadow, and he had prevailed, but the cost was total. His eyes closed, his breath ceased, and for a time he passed beyond the circles of the world. The Fellowship far away did not know it, but upon that mountain the story of the Balrog had reached its end, and another story, stranger and deeper, had begun. Thus the longest pursuit ended, not in the depths of silence, but upon the crown of the world. Fire had risen, light had answered, and both had fallen into stillness. Yet the meaning of that struggle would not fade, for the fall of Durin's bane was not only the end of an ancient terror, it was the passage of Gandalf into a fate beyond what any in Middle-earth could yet imagine. Upon the broken peak of Xeraxigil, silence returned, but it was a silence heavy with aftermath. The storm that had gathered around wizard and demon fell away, leaving only wind and drifting snow. The fire of the Balrog, once fierce enough to light caverns and mountains alike, guttered out upon the rock. Its body, vast and terrible, collapsed in ruin, flames flickering and dying as though quenched by the cold sky. What had endured for ages beneath the mountain had met its end, not in hidden darkness, but in the clear light of the heavens. Durin's Bane, scourge of Khazad-dûm, terror of the First Age reborn, lay still at last. Its roar was no more. Its shadow dissolved into the thin air, unbound from the form it had clothed for so long. Yet victory bore a cost. Gandalf, who had pursued the creature through deeps and heights, who had fought it through water and stone, through flame and storm, now lay upon the broken summit. His body was spent, his cloak torn, his staff shattered, his eyes closed, his breath stilled, and for a time he departed the circles of the world. To the Fellowship, who had fled Moria in grief and despair, his fall had seemed final, an irretrievable loss. They did not see this last battle, nor did they know the price he had paid. To them the wizard was gone, swallowed by the abyss with the terror he faced. Yet upon the heights, Gandalf had prevailed, even if the victory carried him beyond the mortal plane. The Balrog's end was more than the fall of a single being. It was the breaking of a link to the elder days, the extinguishing of a flame that had burned since the discord of Melkor first twisted the music. To see it ended was to glimpse the long arc of history bending toward resolution. What had once terrified armies, what had consumed cities and slain heroes, was undone upon a lonely mountain peak. Its fall was not witnessed by crowds, nor sung by trumpets, but marked only by the wind and the silence of stone. Yet in that stillness lay a truth, that even the deepest fire, if bound to ruin, must in time be quenched. For the dwarves, though they did not yet know it, the death of Durin's Bane would mean the possibility of return. Khazad-dûm, long abandoned, might one day be reclaimed. The halls that had echoed with absence, that had been haunted by shadow, were now free of the terror that had made them uninhabitable. Though the scars of grief could not be erased, the doom that had driven them forth was ended. The name of Durin's Bane would remain in their songs, but now as a memory of what had been endured and overcome, not as a dread that silenced their steps. For the elves, the fall of the Balrog confirmed both their fears and their hopes. They had remembered, they had warned, and at last their remembrance was proven true. Yet in its death they saw also the end of a chapter that had remained unfinished since the First Age. No longer did a servant of Morgoth endure in the heart of Middle-earth. No longer did the shadow of that rebellion walk in flame beneath stone. Its ruin was release, and though sorrow lingered, there was also relief, as though a weight carried for centuries had finally been set down. For men who had half forgotten the tales, the story would be heard anew in wonder and disbelief. That such a being had lived still in the deeps of the world, that a single wizard had pursued it through abyss and mountain until both were consumed, such a tale would be told with awe. It was myth made present, legend stepped into history, a reminder that the world was deeper, stranger, more perilous than most could imagine. In the memory of men, the Balrog's death would not erase its terror, but magnify its legend. Yet beyond all peoples, the meaning of the Balrog's fall was clearest in the greater balance of the world. It showed that no shadow, however old, is beyond the reach of resolution. It proved that even the ruin carried forward from the First Age must in time meet its end. Gandalf had not fought only for the Fellowship, nor only for the dwarves whose halls had been taken, but for the integrity of Arda itself. In that battle the fire of rebellion had been answered by the fire of faithfulness, and in the clash one was extinguished while the other endured. But Gandalf's story did not end upon Zurek Sigil. Though his body lay broken, his spirit was not quenched. He passed into the realm beyond the circles of the world, and there was judged, for he had fulfilled his charge, Though at a cost no lesser spirit could have borne, he was sent back, clothed anew, greater and sterner, transformed from grey into white. His return was not yet known to the fellowship, who mourned him in despair, but in the mystery of the world his work was not finished. From the ruin of battle, from the silence after the fall, hope would rise again, unexpected and unlooked for. The Balrog's fall thus became both an ending and a beginning. For the creature itself, it was the final extinguishing of a fire bound to ruin. For the dwarves, it was the lifting of exile. For the elves, it was the confirmation of memory. For men, it was a tale that bridged myth and history. And for Gandalf, it was the passage through death into renewal. The clash upon Xerac-Sigil was not only the destruction of an enemy, but the transformation of a servant into what he was always meant to be. Snow fell again upon the broken peak, covering the cracks where fire had burst forth, softening the scars of battle. The mountain stood silent, as it had before, as it would again. Yet beneath that silence, something had shifted. The echo of the Balrog's roar was gone. The shadow of its presence dispersed into the thin air. Only the memory remained, a story carried forward by those who would hear it. The mountain was no longer thrown to shadow, but monument to resolution. Thus, the long arc of silence and fire came to its close. From the depths of the abyss to the heights of the mountain, the Balrog had endured. But endurance alone is not victory. In the end, its fire consumed itself, undone by the light it could not overcome. The shadow passed, the flame died, and the world moved forward, carrying the lessons of what had been, that even the deepest bane may be ended, that even silence, when broken, can give way to stillness again. The Balrog's fall did not echo only across the stones of Xerac-Sigil, but across memory itself. With its end came the chance to reflect upon what it had meant, not merely as a foe of dwarves or a terror to the fellowship, but as a symbol that stretched across ages. It had endured from the dawn of discord, a remnant of the first rebellion, preserved by silence and released only by prideful delving. Its life was not a tale of triumph but of consequence, and its death was not a simple victory but a lesson etched into the fabric of the world. For the Balrog was more than shadow and flame. It was the embodiment of the price that rebellion demands, the living burden of choice carried forward into an age that had forgotten its cause. In the songs of the elves, the Balrogs had long stood as warnings, reminders of what could befall the mighty who turned from harmony. Their fire had once been radiant, but corrupted it had become a devouring thing, enslaved to ruin. Durin's bane was the last echo of that sorrow. Its presence beneath the mountain was proof that the past is never entirely buried, that silence conceals but does not erase. To the elves, its final defeat was bittersweet, relief that an ancient shadow was quenched, yet grief that such beings had ever fallen so far. They remembered that the Balrog was not born to terror, but had chosen it, and in that choice they saw both tragedy and inevitability. For the dwarves, the lesson cut deeper still. Khazad-dûm had been their pride, their marvel, their proof that stone itself could be shaped into beauty, everlasting. Yet their delving, their hunger for mithril, had pierced too far, breaking the fragile glass of silence that held back a forgotten fire. Durin's bane was not only their bane, it was the visible cost of ambition untempered by restraint. For centuries they mourned, singing laments for their lost halls, but in the silence of their exile they also came to understand. The wealth of mithril had promised greatness, but it had concealed peril, and the awakening of the Balrog was the price. Its death upon Xerac-Sigil was a release, not only for Middle-earth but for them, for it freed them from the shadow that had haunted their songs, and yet they did not rejoice without caution. They knew too well that ruin often follows pride, and that what is lost cannot always be reclaimed without cost. For men who live swiftly and whose memories fade, the Balrog's tale became legend once more. They heard of the wizard who had faced a demon in the dark, who had fallen yet returned, and their awe mingled truth with myth. To them it was proof that the world was greater than their short lives could measure. They saw that beneath their feet, within the mountains they crossed or the caverns they ignored, slept powers and histories older than their kingdoms. The Balrog's end became a tale of wonder, but also of humility. For if such a being could endure unseen for millennia, what else might lie hidden in the deeps of the world? And yet the greatest lesson lay not in the recounting of peoples, but in the quiet reflection upon the nature of fire and shadow. The Balrog was not evil in essence, but in allegiance. It had been a Maya, a spirit of the same order as Gandalf, Sauron, and others who had chosen different paths. It revealed that the line between light and darkness is not of origin, but of will. To fall is not to be created in shadow, but to choose it, to surrender to pride and power, until flame becomes prison. This was the truth embodied in the Balrog, that even the mightiest may be unmade by their own choices, and that the consequences of those choices may endure beyond the reckoning of their age. The Fellowship, carrying forward after Gandalf's fall, did not yet know the outcome of his struggle. For them, the Balrog was grief without resolution, a reminder of how fragile hope could seem. Yet when Gandalf returned, transformed, his story reframed theirs. The demon had been defeated, but the wizard too had been remade. From fire and shadow he had passed through death into renewal, clothed in white, a sign that not all who fall are lost, and that some battles, though grievous, yield not only loss but transformation. Thus the Balrog's ruin became part of Gandalf's renewal, the darkness against which light was sharpened, the cost by which strength was proven. In this way, the fall of Durin's Bane carried a lesson broader than battle. It taught that silence is not safety if it is built upon denial, that wealth is peril if pursued without wisdom, that shadow may endure if memory fades. Yet it also taught that ruin is not eternal. The fire that devours may be quenched, the shadow that lingers may be dispelled, the grief that haunts may give way to renewal. The death of the Balrog was not triumph alone, but the restoration of balance. It was the quiet reminder that even consequences, however long they endure, must one day meet their end. And so the memory of the Balrog became layered, heavy with meaning. To some it was tragedy, to others warning, to others legend. Yet in every telling, in every reflection, it bore the same truth, that choices ripple outward through time, shaping the world in ways unseen, carried forward until answered. The Balrog was the echo of an ancient rebellion, but in its end that echo was still. The silence that followed was not the silence of concealment, but the silence of completion, the stillness that comes when fire has burned itself out and stone holds its peace once more. Thus the lesson stands. To delve is to risk, to remember is to guard, to endure is to learn. The Balrog's story was never only its own. It was the story of dwarves and their pride, of elves and their memory, of men and their forgetfulness, of Gandalf and his sacrifice. It was the story of fire turned to ruin, of shadow lingering, of silence broken. And in its end it was the story of release. The tale of the Balrog closes not with its roar, but with the stillness that followed its passing. Upon Xarax-Gil, its fire was quenched, its shadow dissolved, and the silence of the mountain returned. Snow fell again upon the peak, soft and unbroken, covering the scars of battle as though the world itself desired to heal. Yet silence does not erase memory, and the memory of Durin's Bane would endure, heavy with sorrow, luminous with meaning. For in its end lay not only the release of a terror, but the reflection of an age, the closing of a thread woven since the beginning of rebellion. The Balrog had been more than a foe of dwarves or a terror to wanderers. It was a fragment of the first discord, a spark from the fire that Melkor had twisted against the harmony of the world. Its endurance was proof that the consequences of ancient choices do not vanish with time. They linger, they sleep, they wait in silence until circumstance draws them forth. To look upon its story is to look upon the truth that history never wholly passes. Shadows endure, even when buried beneath stone, until the moment they are named again. And yet the Balrog's end carries a gentler truth as well. Fire that is misused consumes itself. Shadow that stretches too far dissolves at last into nothing. What seems eternal is not beyond ending, and even the deepest terror may be faced. Gandalf's defiance upon the bridge, his pursuit through the abyss, his struggle upon the mountaintop, these were not only acts of battle but acts of faith, faith that even flame as old as the First Age could be quenched when light stood against it. The fall of Durin's Bane was therefore not only a victory, but a release for the dwarves whose halls had been emptied, for the elves whose memories had been burdened, for Middle-earth itself, long shadowed by the echo of rebellion. The dwarves would one day return to Moria, though not in the age of its ruin. In their songs they would remember both the glory and the grief of Khazad-dûm, but the name of Durin's Bane would no longer be a dread whispered in exile. Instead, it would become part of the story of endurance, a reminder of the cost of pride and the possibility of restoration. For though the mountain had swallowed their home, and though silence had held terror in its depths, the shadow that drove them forth was no more. Their lament would remain, but lament tempered by hope, for the wound had been closed. The elves would continue to sing of fire and shadow, but now their songs carried an ending. The laments of the First Age had spoken of battles unended, of griefs that carried forward, of terrors that had escaped reckoning. Now those songs could soften, for one of those terrors had been answered. Memory would still bear sorrow, but sorrow laced with closure. They would sing of Gandalf's stand upon the bridge, of the long pursuit through deeps and heights, and of the fall upon the mountain. Their songs would remind all who listened that memory is not a burden alone, but a guide, teaching that even the oldest grief may find release. Men, hearing the tale, would weave it into legend. They would speak of the demon of shadow and flame, of the wizard who fell into the abyss and rose again. To them it would be myth, a story told beside firelight, half remembered, half believed. Yet even in legend, truth lingers. For though men may not recall the full weight of ages, they would understand the meaning, that courage can stand against terror, that even the greatest darkness may be quenched, and that fire, though dreadful, is not endless. In this way the story would pass into their lore, reshaped, retold, yet never wholly forgotten. But above all, the Balrog's death revealed something deeper, that shadow and flame are not final. They are passing forms, masks upon the face of rebellion, destined to fall when confronted by steadfast will. The creature that had once strode beside Morgoth, that had shattered armies and silenced songs, that had lain in slumber beneath the mountain for ages uncounted, ended as all such things end, in silence. Its terror, vast though it was, could not outlast the endurance of the world, nor could its fire consume the faith of those who opposed it. This is the great truth its story gives, that ruin is never eternal, that even the fiercest flame burns out at last. For Gandalf, the battle was a crucible. He had descended into darkness and ascended to light, and in that passage he was remade. The Balrog's destruction was his own transformation, the cost of his death the measure of his renewal. He returned not as the grey wanderer, but as the white, clothed in authority greater than before, a sign that light not only resists shadow but is refined by it. Thus the Balrog, even in ruin, became part of the making of what was yet to come, a silent architect of hope through the struggle it demanded. The mountain, once scarred by fire, would heal. Snow would cover the cracks, wind would cleanse the air, stone would rest again in silence. To those who passed below, Sigil would seem no different than any other peak, its summit lost in clouds, its slopes unmarked by the memory of flame. Yet within the stone, within the silence of the earth, the story remained, invisible but indelible. For mountains remember, even if men forget, and the roots of the world bear the echoes of every battle fought upon their crowns. So the tale ends, not in terror, but in elegy. The Balrog of Moria, the demon of shadow and flame, is no more. What once was terror has become memory. What once was fire has become ash. What once was silence broken has become silence restored. The halls of Khazad-dûm still stand empty, the songs of dwarves still heavy with grief, but the shadow that haunted them has passed. The elves still remember, but they remember with closure. Men still tell the tale, but they tell it as legend, not as warning. And Gandalf, who stood upon the bridge and fell into the abyss, has risen, carrying forward the truth that light does not end when shadow rises, but grows stronger in the facing of it. The story of the Balrog is the story of consequence and release, of silence and awakening, of ruin and resolution. It is the story of how the past endures until it is faced, and how even the fiercest terror may at last be ended. It is a reminder that fire, though it consumes, is not endless, and that shadow, though it lingers, cannot outlast light. And so we close the tale, not with fear, but with stillness. The stillness of mountains after storm, of snow after fire, of silence after song. The tale of Durin's Bane lingers, not because the fire still burns, but because the silence it left behind hums with memory. When a shadow so deep is lifted, the air itself seems changed, as though the world breathes differently, lighter and quieter than before. And yet, the story of the Balrog is not one that vanishes into stillness without leaving marks. It is carried in the stones of Moria, in the snow upon Sigil, in the songs of the elves, in the laments of the dwarves, in the legends of men, and in the transformation of Gandalf himself. Its death was an ending, but endings echo, and those echoes shape the paths of all who hear them. The dwarves in distant halls would feel the shift before they knew it. They could not name why the weight on their songs seemed less heavy, why their laments seemed to carry further into the air, why the grief that had pressed for centuries felt, if not erased, then softened. When word came that the demon had fallen, they did not believe at first. How could they, when Durin's Bane had seemed eternal, a curse bound into the stone itself? But the truth spread, and with it, a fragile hope. The exile of Khazad-dûm was no longer an unending. One day, perhaps not soon, they would return. One day the halls would be filled again with light and hammer song, no longer haunted by fire and shadow, but reclaimed in remembrance. The ruin would not be undone, yet it might be healed. The elves, whose songs stretched back beyond memory, sang of the Balrog's end with voices both sorrowful and resolute. They had known its origins, had seen its kind fall into rebellion when the world was still new. To them its destruction was not triumph alone, but elegy. For though it was a foe, it had once been a spirit of light, born to the same harmony as themselves. Its end was the closing of a grief as old as their first battles. In their songs they wove the image of the bridge in Moria, of the fire in the abyss, of the white wizard standing against the black flame. They sang of how light may fall into shadow, but also of how shadow may be broken. And in their singing they reminded themselves and the world that memory, however heavy, need not always bear the weight of despair. Men heard the tale differently. To them it was wonder, a story half myth and half truth, a saga of a wizard who defied a demon and returned greater than before. Around their hearths they told it in many forms. Some spoke of Gandalf's fall as final and tragic, others of his rebirth as miracle, others still of the sheer awe of a being wreathed in flame, stalking beneath the earth. They did not remember the first age, nor did they bear the dwarves' grief or the elves' sorrow. For them it was legend, proof that the world was wider and deeper than their fields and towers, proof that the old powers had not wholly faded. And though they embroidered it with awe and exaggeration, the truth carried through, that terror may be faced, and that courage may kindle hope even in the blackest dark. Yet the deepest meaning of the Balrog's end lies not in the hearts of peoples, but in the thread of the world itself. For the Balrog was a remnant of rebellion, and rebellion carries cost until it is answered. Its survival beneath Khazad-dûm was proof of a wound left unhealed, a discord left unresolved. Its fall upon Xerek-Zigil was the stitching closed of that wound, the quieting of that discord. The world was lighter for its passing, though most could not feel it. It was as though an old burden, carried in silence, had at last been laid down. For Gandalf, the Balrog was both an ending and a passage. To face it was to expend all that he was as the Grey, to empty himself utterly in fire and shadow, until nothing remained. To overcome it was to die, and in dying to be remade. His return as the White was born out of that confrontation, for in the breaking of the Balrog he too was broken, and in that breaking was transformed. The demon of shadow and flame was not only an enemy to be defeated, it was the crucible through which Gandalf was tempered into what the world still required. Thus, even in its ruin, the Balrog's place in the tale was not meaningless. By its fire, light was tested. By its shadow, light was revealed. The mountain itself keeps the memory. The stones of Moria still echo with the sound of its footsteps. The pillars still remember the heat of its flame. The abyss still bears the scars of the bridge that broke. The waters deep below still tremble with the fury of their struggle. And Xerek-Zigil, high and crowned with snow, holds in silence the mark of that last battle, though storms and frost now hide it. Mountains remember long, even when men forget, and their silence is not emptiness, but witness. Every gust of wind across the peak carries the memory of fire quenched. Every drift of snow upon the stone carries the truth that shadow is not eternal. The story of the Balrog endures, because it is more than history. It is warning, it is elegy, it is lesson. It speaks of pride that delves too deep, of memory that guards against forgetfulness, of courage that does not falter before terror. It speaks of ruin that lingers, and of the truth that even such ruin may one day be ended. For what is shadow but the absence of light, and what is flame but a hunger that consumes itself? In the end, the Balrog was undone not because it was weak, but because it was bound to ruin, and ruin cannot last forever. And so the silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with meaning, with memory, with release. The halls of Khazad-dûm remain vast and hollow, but they are no longer ruled by flame. The songs of the elves still grieve, but they grieve a wound now closed. The legends of men still speak, but they speak of courage more than terror. And Gandalf, reborn from the struggle, carries forward into the tale that yet unfolds. The Balrog has passed, but its story endures, written in stone, in song, in fire quenched and shadow dissolved. Thus the circle closes. The demon of shadow and flame, the terror of Khazad-dûm, the remnant of the First Age, is gone. What remains is the stillness of mountains, the memory of peoples, and the quiet lesson carried forward, that even the oldest darkness may be faced, that even silence concealing ruin may be broken, that even fire raging in rebellion may be quenched at last. The tale ends not in fear, but in stillness, in remembrance, in hope. The fire is out, the shadow dispersed. What remains is the silence of resolution.